The tariffs hit in 2018. China's share of global manufacturing was supposed to shrink by 2024. It had grown. That is not a rounding error. That is not a lag effect waiting to correct itself. That is the result of a policy built on a diagnosis that was wrong from the first day it was written. The diagnosis was simple. Make Chinese exports expensive enough and American companies would move their supply chains. Some would come home. Some would go to Vietnam, Mexico, India, anywhere but China. The theory had a name in policy circles: decoupling. And for a moment, the early data looked like it was working. It wasn't working. The trade numbers were being rerouted, not restructured. The supply chains didn't leave China. They learned to leave China on paper. Vietnamese factories started processing Chinese components before export. Mexican assembly plants were running on Chinese inputs. The tariffs created a labeling problem, not a manufacturing shift. What changed was the last stop on the journey, not the origin of the value. But that is still only the surface fracture. The deeper one was happening simultaneously, and it was moving in the opposite direction. While American companies were rerouting around tariffs, Chinese manufacturers were doing something different. They were consolidating. Smaller, less efficient producers were absorbed or eliminated. The firms that survived were the ones with the scale, the automation investment, and the government backing to absorb the cost pressure without passing it all downstream. The named fault line here is the U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 tariff framework, the legal mechanism that imposed tariffs on over $360 billion of Chinese goods and was designed to create enough sustained economic pressure to force supply chain relocation. The framework assumed that price pressure alone would restructure a manufacturing base that had been built over 4 decades with deliberate state coordination, infrastructure investment, and a workforce trained specifically for industrial production at scale. It assumed cost was the only variable that mattered. It was wrong about that. And the people who designed it had access to enough economic history to know they were wrong. Chinese manufacturers didn't just absorb the tariff pressure, they used it. The consolidation that followed wasn't incidental. It was the predictable output of hitting a state-backed industrial system with a market-based instrument and expecting a market-based response. A market-based system retreats when margins compress. A state-coordinated system restructures. China's manufacturing base restructured. It moved up the value chain, away from the low-margin assembly work that was most exposed to tariff pressure and into the higher complexity production where switching costs for buyers are much higher. Electric vehicle components, industrial robotics, advanced battery cells, semiconductor packaging. The internal communications, the exemption requests, and the data that preceded this fracture. Those are in a free weekly written breakdown. Link in the description for anyone who wants the structural picture, not the event coverage. The tariffs were supposed to create space for American and allied manufacturing to grow into. Instead, they created pressure that sorted Chinese industry, eliminated the weak, concentrated the strong, and accelerated exactly the kind of industrial upgrading that makes a manufacturing base harder to displace. By the time the Biden administration reviewed the framework in 2024 and kept most of it in place, the consolidation had already run. The instrument was still pointed at a target that had already moved. The fracture wasn't that the tariffs failed to hurt China in the short term. Some did hurt, some sectors did contract. The fracture was that the policy was operating on a model of how industrial systems respond to price pressure, and that model was built for a different kind of economy than the one it was applied to. The conclusion I keep landing on is this: the United States applied a market instrument to a non-market problem and called it strategy. The instrument generated political returns immediately and industrial returns never. The gap it was supposed to close is wider now than when the first tariff landed. That gap is not abstract. It shows up in electric vehicle supply chains where American manufacturers are sourcing Chinese battery components because no domestic alternative exists at scale. It shows up in solar panel manufacturing where Chinese firms hold over 80% of global production capacity across every stage of the supply chain. It shows up in the industrial robotics sector, where Chinese producers have moved from assemblers of foreign components to designers of the components themselves. These are not sectors where the tariff pressure was absent. These are sectors where it was present, and where Chinese industrial policy used the pressure period to consolidate position, while American policy was still debating whether industrial policy was an appropriate role for government. The forward-looking statement is specific. The next round of tariffs, and there will be a next round, will produce the same output if it arrives without the investment companion. Price pressure on a state-directed system, unaccompanied by directed domestic investment, does not rebalance competition. It accelerates the consolidation of the system it was supposed to weaken. The fracture point was never 2018. It was the decade before it, when China was building the industrial base that made it pressure-resistant, and American trade policy was still operating on the assumption that market signals alone would determine where manufacturing lived. 2018. The tariff hits. Chinese exports to the United States drop, and within months, total Chinese exports don't. Factories don't shut down. They shift. Orders don't disappear. They reroute. The assumption underneath the policy was simple: raise the cost of Chinese goods, and demand will fall. Production will follow demand. China's manufacturing base shrinks. That didn't happen, because the system wasn't built the way the policy assumed it was. The fault line sits inside a very specific belief: the tariff pass-through assumption. The idea that tariffs imposed at the border would transmit cleanly backward through supply chains and land on Chinese producers. That assumption treated global manufacturing like a straight line. It isn't. It's a network. Dense. Redundant. Designed to bend without breaking. Which means when the tariff hit, the pressure didn't move backward the way policymakers expected. It dispersed sideways. Chinese exporters didn't absorb the full cost. They split it. Some passed it to U.S. consumers, some cut margins, but a significant portion never showed up in the bilateral trade data at all. It moved through third countries. Vietnam's exports to the United States surged. So did Mexico's. So did Malaysia's. That looks like diversification until you track where the inputs came from. They came from China. The products stopped being labeled "made in China." The manufacturing didn't stop being Chinese. That's the break, because the policy wasn't targeting production. It was targeting direct trade flows, a much narrower surface, and the system adjusted to that surface with speed. Within a year, Chinese firms began relocating final assembly stages abroad while keeping higher value components at home. Intermediate goods, the parts that actually carry industrial capability, continued to originate in China, which means the tariff filtered out the least valuable stage of production and left the core intact. And in some cases, strengthened it. Because once you force a system to reroute under pressure, you don't just get avoidance. You get optimization. Supply chains got shorter where they needed to be, more redundant where they were exposed, more regional in appearance, but still anchored in Chinese industrial capacity. The visible map changed. The underlying structure didn't, which is a quiet way of saying the policy measured the wrong thing. Trade deficits narrowed in certain categories. Headlines followed. But the actual industrial footprint, the ability to produce at scale, across sectors with integrated inputs, remained concentrated. And in key sectors, it expanded. Electronics, machinery, components that require precision, not just labor. Tariffs didn't slow that trajectory. They forced firms to rethink it. And once firms rethink a system under constraint, they rarely rebuild it the same way. They rebuild it stronger against the exact pressure they just experienced, which means the tariffs didn't just fail to collapse Chinese manufacturing. They trained it. They exposed where it was vulnerable, over-reliance on direct export channels, and forced a correction, more diversification, more indirect routing, more control over upstream production, less dependence on any single market. That wasn't the intended outcome, but it is the observable one. And the more uncomfortable implication sits just under that. If a policy designed to constrain a system ends up strengthening its adaptability, then the constraint wasn't applied at the system's critical point. It was applied at the surface. What was just described, the rerouting through third countries, the internal adjustments, the data behind those shifts, made it into official trade statistics. The internal discussions, firm-level strategies, and early warning signals that preceded it are detailed in the weekly breakdown for those who want the structural picture, not just the outcomes, because the failure here isn't that tariffs exist. It's that they were aimed at a version of the system that no longer exists. And once you see that the pressure was applied to trade flows while the real leverage sat inside production networks, the outcome stops looking surprising. The mechanism didn't fail all at once. It failed in layers, each one small enough to ignore, but together enough to invert the policy. Start with how tariffs actually move through a supply chain. A tariff is a tax on imports. It lands at the border, But the cost doesn't stay there. It gets negotiated, split between exporter, importer, distributor, and ultimately the consumer. That split is the pass-through. The policy assumed China would absorb most of it. Instead, the burden fragmented. Chinese exporters cut prices where they could. U.S. importers absorbed some margin loss to keep supply stable. Consumers paid more in certain categories. But the key shift happened outside that equation entirely. Production began to move, not out of China, but around the tariff. Final assembly relocated first because it's the easiest piece to move. It's labor-intensive, lower margin, and less dependent on deep infrastructure. Vietnam became the headline. Mexico followed. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia each picked up pieces. That looks like manufacturing leaving China. It isn't, because the high-value stages didn't move. Semiconductors, precision components, industrial inputs, the parts that require dense supplier networks and technical depth, stayed inside China, and in many cases expanded. So what changed was the last step. The label changed, the origin didn't, which means the tariff hit the least critical part of the chain and left the core untouched. There's a second layer, and this one was visible in real time. Chinese firms didn't just relocate assembly, they restructured ownership. Subsidiaries in Southeast Asia began exporting to the United States as independent entities. On paper, the supply chain diversified. In practice, control remained centralized. It's a legal workaround, a simple one. If a Chinese firm owns a factory in Vietnam, the goods ship from Vietnam. They bypass tariffs. The data records a shift away from China. But the industrial capacity, the capital, the engineering, the production logic, still traces back to Chinese firms. So the policy created an incentive, not to reduce dependence on China, but to hide it inside other jurisdictions. That incentive was predictable, which makes the next part harder to ignore. Policymakers had access to this structure before the tariffs were imposed. Supply chain data already showed how integrated regional production had become. Intermediate goods flows, the components that move between countries before final assembly, were heavily concentrated in China. That data didn't disappear. It was deprioritized, because the metric being targeted was the bilateral trade deficit, a visible number, easy to communicate, easy to measure, and easy to improve without changing the underlying system, which is exactly what happened. The U.S. deficit with China narrowed in specific categories. At the same time, deficits with Vietnam, Mexico, and others expanded. Aggregate dependence didn't fall, it redistributed. There's a moment here that deserves more attention than it gets. Tariffs were escalated, even as rerouting became obvious, which means the policy wasn't adjusted when the mechanism started to fail. It was doubled down, because reversing course would have meant admitting the initial assumption that tariffs would transmit backward cleanly was wrong, and instead the system adapted faster than the policy. There's one more layer, and this is where the effect flips from neutral to reinforcing. Once Chinese firms established production nodes outside the country, they didn't just use them for tariff avoidance, they used them to expand market access. Factories in Vietnam didn't only serve the US, they served Europe, ASEAN, regional trade blocs with favorable terms, which means the tariff didn't isolate China. It globalized its manufacturing footprint. More nodes, more flexibility, more routes to market. The constraint created optionality, and optionality is resilience. This is the part where the mechanism stops looking like a failure and starts looking like a redesign, just not by the people who wrote the policy. The conclusion I keep landing on is that the tariff wasn't applied to the point of control. It was applied to the point of visibility. Trade flows are visible. Production networks are not. So the policy optimized what could be measured and left what actually mattered intact, even strengthened, because once firms build alternative routes under pressure, they keep them. They don't revert to the old structure. They operate both, which means after the tariffs, the system didn't just survive. It became harder to target the next time. The cost didn't stay where the policy aimed it. It moved, and where it landed explains what this actually was. U.S. importers paid first. Margins tightened almost immediately. Not enough to collapse demand, just enough to compress flexibility, which forced a choice: raise prices or absorb losses. Most did both, selectively. Consumers followed. Prices edged higher across tariffed categories, not dramatically, but consistently. Appliances, electronics, inputs that quietly feed into other goods. It didn't look like a shock. It felt like friction, and friction spreads. Manufacturers inside the United States didn't get clean relief either. Many rely on imported components. Those inputs became more expensive, which means the tariff designed to protect domestic production also increased its costs. That's not a contradiction. That's what happens when supply chains are integrated. So the policy taxed consumption, strained importers, and complicated domestic production. Without collapsing the external competitor it targeted, that competitor adjusted. Chinese firms didn't carry the primary burden, they redistributed it. Lower margins here, shifted assembly there, expanded upstream control where it mattered, which means the cost didn't force contraction, it forced reallocation. And reallocation, in this case, reinforced the system it was meant to weaken. There's a pattern in where the pressure ultimately settled. Small and mid-sized firms absorbed more of it than large ones. They have less leverage, less ability to restructure supply chains quickly, less capacity to establish overseas subsidiaries, so they paid. Larger firms moved faster. They diversified sourcing, reclassified goods, relocated final stages. They turned policy friction into operational advantage. That gap widened, which tells you something about intent versus outcome. If the goal was to broadly weaken Chinese manufacturing, the cost would need to concentrate there. It didn't. If the goal was to reshape supply chains toward domestic production, the cost would need to favor domestic firms. It didn't. It favored scale and adaptability. Which means the system rewarded the actors already best positioned to navigate complexity. And those actors were often the ones already embedded in globalized production networks, including Chinese firms themselves. That's the redistribution. Not across countries, across capabilities. My read on this fracture is that it exposed a mismatch between the tool and the system. Tariffs assume pressure travels in a straight line. This system roots around pressure. So the burden landed where routing is hardest. Smaller firms, consumers, segments with less flexibility. And the signal that sends is clear. The policy didn't isolate a rival. It filtered the market. Those who could adapt stayed competitive. Those who couldn't absorbed the cost. Which is a quiet way of saying the outcome wasn't evenly distributed, and that unevenness wasn't accidental once the mechanism became visible. Because once you see where the cost is going, you can change course. Or you can continue, knowing who pays. The choice that followed tells you which path was taken. The conclusion is blunt. The tariffs did not fail in execution. They failed in design. They targeted trade flows in a system where control sits inside production networks. That mismatch guaranteed the outcome, because when you tax the visible layer and ignore the structural one, the system doesn't break. It reconfigures, and once it reconfigures, it learns. China's manufacturing base didn't just endure the pressure. It adapted around it, then incorporated that adaptation into its baseline. More external nodes, more indirect routes, more control over upstream components, less dependence on any single export channel. That is not erosion, that is reinforcement. The deeper implication sits underneath the surface data. A policy intended to reduce reliance on Chinese manufacturing instead obscured it. Supply chains began to look more diversified on paper while remaining concentrated in function, which means future policy built on those appearances risks misdiagnosing the same system again and repeating the same outcome. I think the more honest diagnosis here is that the system responded exactly the way it was structured to respond. Dense networks don't absorb pressure by collapsing. They absorb it by rerouting and by strengthening the paths that remain. So the question going forward isn't whether tariffs will be used again. They will. The question is whether they will be aimed at the same surface. Because if they are, the next iteration of this system is already prepared, and it will adapt faster.